Hey guys, welcome back to the Workplace and Apprenticeship 20 videos. In this video, we're going to look at lesson 2 from chapter 2, which is talking all about bar graphs. So just as a quick recap, a bar graph uses horizontal or vertical bars to display discrete data. And discrete data is data that can only have distinct values. For example, the number of students in our class would be an example of distinct data because we can't have partial values in terms of the number of students. You can't have half of a student, you can't have 3/4. You either have a student or you don't. So that right there is an example of distinct values. Other examples could be maybe qualitative data, where maybe you're looking at maybe hair colors. Maybe you have a student that has black hair, maybe there's one that has brown hair, maybe there's one that's blonde hair. Okay, so it's typically distinct values that you cannot have partials of. So let's move on to our examples. This one here is the first one in our notes. So James is an archaeologist who has worked at a dig near Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, over several years. Her records help her analyze which hunting methods were most commonly used by people in the past. The artifacts she has obtained include an ulis, which are knives with semicircular blades used by women to cut food, clean game, and scrape skins, and stones that formed part of kumalek tuins, which are hunting weapons used to catch birds. So below here we're given a chart that represents all of the Inuit artifacts that James has found. And what we're going to do with that data is displayed on a horizontal bar graph. Now, before we jump into creating our bar graph, we first need to talk about, well, what is a horizontal bar graph? So a standard bar graph typically has rectangular bars that are going up and down. So this one here is a vertical bar graph. But in this case here, we're going to be looking at a horizontal bar graph, which means that our bars are going to be going from left to right instead of going up and down. Okay, so here our typical traditional bar graph will look like the one here to the right, but the one that we're going to be doing in this example here is going to have bars going left to right. So it's a little bit mixed up compared to what you might traditionally see in terms of a bar graph. So I'm just going to scroll down here just so we can get to our graph. So your first step when you are doing any kind of a graph is to give this a title. And when we're looking at giving it a kind of title, it should really summarize what is going on in that situation. And in this situation, you can go back and reread it, or sometimes our title in our charts can sometimes give it away. So here it says Inuit artifacts, and if you want to be a little bit more thorough, you might want to say Inuit artifacts, and then here we're talking about James, so maybe we'll want to say Inuit artifacts James has found. So let's give it a title. So Inuit artifacts James has found. Okay, so once we labeled our graph, now what we need to do is label this each of the axes. So that is labeling the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. So to do that, we're going to go back and look at the chart that we're given here. So here we're given the types of Inuit artifacts found, and then here we're given the amount of artifacts found. So one thing that's really important here is that when you're labeling your bar graph, typically your horizontal axis is typically where your independent values go. But in this case, because we're drawing a horizontal bar graph, it's going to be a little bit backwards or flipped from, say, a standard bar graph. So rather than it being on your horizontal, it's going to be on your vertical instead. And in this case here, the types of Inuit artifacts found is going to be our independent value. So then that means the amount found will be our dependent, which goes on the horizontal axis. So just to recap, so typically your horizontal axis is for the independent, but because we're doing a horizontal bar graph, it means that our independent goes on the vertical and our dependent goes on the horizontal. So let's go and label those. So here for our vertical axis, we have types of artifacts found. One thing here that's going to be really important here is I'm leaving lots of space here because I do need to go back and label the types of artifacts. So, and I don't want to be abbreviating any of the words, so make sure you leave lots of room in between your label of the axis and your graph itself. Scrolling on down here, so now we're going to label our horizontal axis, and that one there was the amount of artifacts found. Or you can even label that the number of artifacts found. So now we've given our graph a title, we've labeled your horizontal and vertical axis, then we can go and label our spacing. So let's start with labeling the types of artifacts found. So to look at your spacing, all you have to do is look at the number of artifacts, the types of artifacts that you're looking at. So here we have 5 different types of artifacts. And if you go scroll down here, looking at your graph, if you were to count each of the squares on your graph, you would know that there are 15 squares there. So one thing that's here that's really important is that when you're trying to figure out your spacing, with bar graphs, you need to first of all make sure you have an initial space in between your horizontal axis and then your first bar, so you always leave a space here. Then you can go either up by 1 square or 2 squares. And one thing that's really important here is that you're going to want to make sure you use at least half of your graph or more. And so you might just need to play around with it. And once when you get some more practice, trying to figure out your spacing will become a lot more easier. But like I said, you need that practice. So if there's 5 different types of artifacts and we have 15 lines, my guess is that let's try using every 2 squares for every type of artifact. And one thing that's really important here is that with each of those bars, remember you have to leave a space between each type of artifact. So let's leave a space. Then our first type of artifact will have 2 squares. Then you're going to leave a space. Then you go 2 squares for your next type of artifact. Leave a space, 2 squares for your type of artifact. Then leave a space, 2 squares for your artifact. Leave a space, and then 2 squares for your artifact. So what we should be able to find is that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little bars there to represent the types of artifacts found. So let's just recap. First of all, you need to have initial space at the bottom of your bar graph. Then you need to have a space separating each of those different bars. Also, try and make sure you use at least half of your graph or more. And even then, you might even want to use at least 2/3, because even sometimes using only half is not going to use up very much of that graph. So maybe even try and shoot for at least 2/3. So let's go back and label each of those types of artifacts. So looking at our graph here, our first one here was the hunting hooks. I'll put that down here on the bottom. So we have hunting hooks. Then our next one was the Olus. Our next one was the harpoon tip. Then we had the goggles. And then we had the Kalamiktuans. All right, so now once when you get that done, now we're going to label the horizontal axis. And just going to scroll up here. So looking at our chart here, our highest value here is going to be 25. So we want to make sure we can fit up to 25 on that horizontal axis. So remember, looking down here, if you were to count your squares, you know that there are 15 squares there. So you might even want to try going up by either, you could try by 2s if you can count that out, see if that works. You can go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30. So as you note there, it goes over 25. So that one there would actually be a very good place, I guess, in terms of spacing. And one thing here is that you also don't have to label every single line. That just gets very tedious and can look a little bit cluttered. So let's just label every second line here. And we'll be going up by 4s for every second line. So as I said earlier, trying to figure out your spacing for these graphs will just take time and practice. And so really you just have to play around with it. And if say it didn't work the first time, just go back and erase it. That's why we use pencils in math, so you can go back and fix things. It'll be a little bit frustrating at first, but it will get easier, I promise. You just need to practice. Okay, so now that we're done that, now we can go and actually create our bar graphs. So looking at our hunting hooks here, in the chart, it said we had 4 artifacts. So going from the bottom of your graph, you're going to go up to 4, or I guess going to the left to 4, and then creating that 2 square thick rectangle. Then you can color it in if you like. It'll help us to see it, especially if you're drawing with pencil, it might be hard to see that. So if you shade it in, it might help us to see where information is. Then the Olus had 7. So that one there should be halfway between 6 and 8. So go up to your rectangle. It's going to be 2 lines thick, and then connect it with your beginning ends and shade it in. Hopefully yours looks a lot better than mine. All right, then we had the harpoon tips, and if we're looking at our chart there, it said we had 14 of those. So go from 14, go all the way up to your harpoon tips, and create those rectangular bars. And hopefully yours are not so shaky as mine. Okay, then we had the goggles, which was 3. So we're at 2, and then we're going to go halfway between 2 and 4. Color that in. Then we had the McMurchy, which was 25. So go to 25, go all the way up to your McMurchy, and then draw your lines. What a beautiful graph I've made. Wow, I'm so impressed. All right, so once when you've drawn that, you've labeled everything. You've labeled a title, you've given each of your axes a name, then you've labeled each of your spacing, you've drawn your bars, then you're all done. Okay, so that is everything for horizontal bar graphs. So just remember, with a traditional bar graph, you typically have to draw your vertical bar graph, which will be having bars going up and down. But in this case, we're drawing the horizontal, so it kind of looks like a sideways or a rotated vertical bar graph. So just be careful with that, but otherwise it's the exact same type of steps, just with a vertical bar graph, your type of artifacts would be on the horizontal, and the number of artifacts would be on your vertical. So just a slight difference between your horizontal versus vertical bar graph. So if you guys have any questions, just make sure to come see me in class, or you guys can text me on Remind 101. So thank you guys so much for watching.